As Tony indicated, I'm sure many of you have heard something about Reverend Moon. And even in your time in America, if you did not hear so much in your own country, if you ask people about Reverend Moon, you will get many responses. Reverend Moon is probably one of the most controversial and mysterious people, not because he himself tries to be secret, but because what he has done is so hard for people to understand, that there's so many different opinions of him. It's really amazing. So, we'd like to share with you something about the facts concerning this man. What I'll be speaking about is drawn from sometimes his own words, but mostly from what witnesses have said. Those who were actually there with him, who have seen him with their own eyes, and from published accounts about his life. This is the man who is responsible for you being here. Directly. And I know that you've wondered, it's natural for you to wonder, why on earth does Reverend Moon spend so much money and so much effort to bring us here? Well, I think as you learn about his life, you may get an answer to that question. Reverend Moon is someone that has accomplished very much in his life and has gained tremendous influence in the world. But all throughout this time, he remains a very simple person. He's very, very simple. And in fact, many of us know him in fishing, just being with him on a boat, fishing. And he's just a very good fisherman, by the way. And if you were with him in ordinary life, you would never suspect the kinds of things he has done and the kind of influence he has in the world. He's a very, very simple person. But on the other hand, he's so extraordinary. This is something he said last year. 10 years from now, we will reach the year 2000. The task I have before me now is to see whether I can achieve world peace before that time. Now, what kind of man is this? First of all, why does he believe that world peace could be possible within the next 10 years? And the next question is, why would he feel responsible to bring world peace? I can't think of anybody else in the world right now that feels personally responsible to bring world peace. And yet, why does he feel this way? Again, as you learn something about his life, you can understand what's behind this kind of remark and this purpose. He was born in a very small town, Cheongju province, and he was born of a poor family. So his parents were very poor farmers. And they were a part of the Buddhist religion. And he was in Korea at that time. He was under control of the Japanese. So as you learned this morning from Bob's lecture, the Japanese were trying to eliminate Korean culture at that moment and had an iron grip, like a slavery relationship with Korea. So it was illegal to do anything but act like Japanese and to have a Japanese religion. When Reverend Moon was just a little boy, 10 years old, his parents became Christian. This was illegal. And so he saw his parents and his family become part of a religion which was outlawed, and they would have to pursue this religion at the cost of their lives. Many Christians were being killed by the Japanese for their faith. So this, of course, affected him. Also, when he was a little boy, he saw the terrible things the Japanese did to the Korean people. And this created in him a burning desire to find some way to stop this injustice. When he was a young boy, about 12 years old, he says to us that he began to pray for unusual things. He began to pray to have more wisdom, more faith, and more love than anyone who ever lived. By the time he was 15, he had already decided that somehow he would end the suffering of the world through education. So he determined he would get 3 PhDs, which was almost impossible for a country boy. This was his idea, and that somehow he would become so smart that he would end the tragedy in the world. But of course, that wasn't what happened. Here he is, he's 7 years old in this picture. Can you see where he is? This is right here. Eventually, his whole life changes through a dramatic experience. By this time, Reverend Moon had developed a habit of praying a lot. And he would go by the Han River and he would go into the mountains and pray a lot. And he would pray trying to understand, maybe the way you have, why is there so much suffering in the world? Why are good people treated so badly? And why is this small country being treated so badly? What is God? Where is God? Why does God allow so much evil? All these things were on his mind, maybe like you have also asked. And through his deep prayer and effort, one morning, on Easter morning in 1936, Jesus appeared to him. He said Jesus appeared to him as a substantial vision. And Jesus began to tell him of his own life experience. He told him about his disappointments, about his suffering and his misery. And Reverend Moon tells us that he cried as he learned all of these things. And then Jesus said to him, according to what Reverend Moon tells us, Jesus said to him, I died unable to accomplish my mission. And I ask you, are you willing to accomplish this mission? To bring God's ideal world to the earth. Reverend Moon said that he couldn't say yes. It was such an incredibly big responsibility. How could he say yes? Because he knew his whole life would be one of suffering. But he could not say no. And so after struggling with it, he finally gave his promise to Jesus and to God that he would live his life to bring the ideal world on earth and to end human suffering and the suffering of God. So from that point on, his life dramatically changed. From that point on, he lived kind of a double life. During the day, he was an ordinary student. He looked like an ordinary student. But at night, he would spend his time with God, praying desperately to understand the very things that we've been talking about. Who is God? Why is God allowing so much suffering? Where is this evil coming from? What is good? What is the meaning of life? He desperately tried to find the answers to these questions. And so from the time he was a 16-year-old, for the next 9 years, he was always pursuing this kind of secret course to find these answers, praying desperately and through his life experience to find the answers. So during this time, as I said, he was also a student, and he always tried to understand people very much. He tried to study people and how to make people happy and how do people feel loved. One thing he talks about is when he was a boy that he would go to the village of the poor people and he would try to somehow comfort them. One example is that he learned that for poor people, it's very humiliating to have hair that is long and looks sloppy. So he would cut their hair as a way of giving them joy and respect. And in this way, he would try to learn about all different kinds of people and what made them happy. Also during this time, Reverend Moon eventually, as he was a student, he eventually went to university. And he went to a university in Japan, and he studied electrical engineering. We probably have some engineers here, right? So he studied engineering also, because he wanted to understand the natural laws and how they relate to spiritual laws. But he went to Japan, and the Japanese hated the Koreans. And so they treated the Korean people like animals. And at that point, he experienced directly what racism is. And he made a determination that somehow he would end racism. During this time, very interesting, his years in university. his roommate, who eventually told this story years later, his roommate in his room told stories about, he never knew what Reverend Moon was doing in his spiritual searching, but he saw him reading the Bible all the time, that he saw that there was a Bible, 3 Bibles, Japanese, English, and Korean, and that they had all kinds of markings under every line, and the pages were all worn out from being read. And he said also that there was ink running on many pages where it looked as though Reverend Moon had been crying over the Bible and had run the ink. But he didn't understand what Reverend Moon was doing. Reverend Moon would go and work in the dockyards with the poor people and make money this way. And he would study philosophy and all different kinds of situations to understand the questions of life. Also at that time, he led an underground resistance movement of students against the Japanese. Eventually, this caused him great trouble, because when he came back to Korea, the Japanese police found him. And they put him in prison, they jailed him, and they tortured him, trying to get him to reveal the names of the other students involved. He never said a word, and he was able to save their lives, and eventually he was released. But this was the first time when Reverend Moon was about 19, 20 years old. This was the first time he was put in jail and tortured. It was not the last. Eventually, when World War II was over, then there was great joy in Korea as the Japanese were forced out. And finally, the Korean people had some taste of freedom. They had freedom of religion, freedom of belief. And as you know, they began to create their own government. So during this time, Reverend Moon would often go out into the streets and he would begin teaching and talking about the principle, things he had learned. But at this point, Reverend Moon is 25 years old, and he has now discovered most of the principle. He began sharing these ideas with the people. He gets inspired to go to the north, which is the city of Pyongyang in Korea. Pyongyang was famous as being the most religious city in all of Asia. It was called the Jerusalem of the East. And in Pyongyang, there were all kinds of people that were looking for some sort of new truth, new understanding. Now, at the same time, you know what was happening in North Korea after the war. Kim Il-sung was gradually gaining power, right? And he began to create a Stalinist kind of government in the north. And even though this was the most religious city in Asia, gradually the government authorities were trying to destroy religion. So he went there, and within a couple of months, he had gathered a very large following of people. Because many of the people in the north had been praying during their suffering time and had received insights about the principle. So when Reverend Moon began sharing the unification principle with them, they said, yes, I had exactly the same idea in prayer. I know this is true. And they would come to him. The problem was that many of these people were leaving their old churches to follow him. And a lot of these people were a big source of money for these other churches. And so the other church leaders began to get jealous. You can maybe understand something like this. They got jealous of Reverend Moon because he was gaining so much popularity. And so they would go to the police with accusations, trying to accuse him of some crime. Well, the police were only too happy because they were looking for some excuse to put any religious leader in jail. And so they used the opportunity to arrest him. After only a couple months in Pyongyang, he was arrested, brought to the police station, and he was gradually tortured. He endured tremendous tortures, Japanese-style tortures at this time, for 5 months. They starved him. They wouldn't let him sleep. They beat him, trying to break him and destroy him. Finally, at the end of 5 months, they did the last form of torture. And this was a torture where they tied his hands behind his back, and then they hung him by his wrists. This, of course, would pull the shoulders out. And then they took a stick and they beat him on the stomach and on the organs. They beat him all here. And the idea was to totally break his bones and destroy his internal organs. And then they dropped him to the floor. He was unconscious. And they threw him out into the garbage in the snow. They thought he was dead. His followers found him. And somehow, over a period of 6 months, Reverend Moon was able to survive. But eventually, he did not stop, but he went back out into the streets and began teaching again. At this point, it was completely illegal to speak about religion, and so Kim Il-sung's police came and arrested him again. So in 1946, he had gone to Pyongyang. Now, by 1948, the authorities gave him a false trial, and they sentenced him to prison. This was not an ordinary prison, but this was simply a death camp, a concentration camp. They sent him to Hungnam prison. It was a fertilizer factory. You know fertilizer? You put the plants. Well, the Japanese had left behind a huge mound of fertilizer. It was lime, nitrogen lime fertilizer. And this huge pile of fertilizer, the prisoners would spend all their day digging into it, sticking it into bags, and then hauling it to a truck. Well, though this was considered to be a prison, actually it was impossible for people to survive. This was the mound of fertilizer. And they would spend all their days picking away at this and hauling it. The fertilizer had the effect of burning your skin. So it would burn your skin eventually off your hands until you could see the bones. The smell and the fumes would kill the prisoners. And ordinarily, when people would do work like this, they would have to be paid very well, and they would have to be fed very well, or people couldn't do it. But the prisoners were forced to pick up huge bags, 80 pounds each, about 1,300 for a group of 10, and then they would not be fed very much at all. In fact, they would be fed a ball of rice about the size of a fist for one day, about this big. So the idea was that you wouldn't starve quickly, you would starve slowly. They would get a lot of work out of you, and you would gradually starve to death. And the most painful and terrible kind of death. Most people would not survive 6 months. Some people survived 9 months. Virtually nobody could survive a year. Reverend Moon realized in this situation that he could not possibly survive through any ordinary means, but he would have to do something very unusual to live. We hear stories about Reverend Moon's life in prison from some prisoners who actually did survive. One of them was a leader, and so he got special privileges, and he didn't work as hard. He was able to survive and tell us years later about what he saw in prison. One man, Mr. Pak, tells us the conditions were just simply inhuman, he said. The men were so hungry that they would look like skeletons. Their face was yellow with disease. They would be completely starved and emaciated. And they would be so hungry that they would drag themselves through the day to get to their meal. And then oftentimes, even as they ate, they would forget that they had eaten the food because they were going crazy. And then they would start hitting the person next to them, accusing them of stealing the food. And then sometimes the men would die right there in the meal. And the other men, instead of being sorry for this person, they would just jump on him and try to pick the rice out of his mouth. They were so desperately hungry. So the men were acting just like animals. It was a miserable situation. But Mr. Pak says that this young man, Reverend Moon, this young man would always try to help the others. That he would do his work, and then he would try to help other people accomplish their work so that they would get food. And this is how Mr. Pak met Reverend Moon, was that Reverend Moon came and tried to help him accomplish his job so that he would be getting food. So the prison, in the time in the prison, through Reverend Moon's own example of life, Reverend Moon could never talk about God, never talk about the things that he knew. But by his own example, through the kindness that he gave to others, then gradually men were drawn to him. In fact, during this time in prison, men would have dreams of prisoner 586. They would have dreams about prisoner 586. This was Reverend Moon's number. And they would be drawn to him. And then they would have a kind of relationship. And gradually a whole group of people became very close and supported each other in prison with him. Reverend Moon had a very unusual way of life. He said that he knew he would not survive if he tried to live on food. So he decided he had to live somehow on love and joy. So what he did was, in the first 3 months, he took that little bit of rice and he cut it in half. And he gave half the rice to somebody else who was starving to death. And he said by doing this, he knew he had to control his mind, but by doing this, it gave him joy and pleasure. And he could find some way to inspire himself to live. And then eventually, after 3 months, he would eat the whole ball of rice, and then he felt very happy because now he had twice as much. And he felt this was like God's love. This is what he said was the way he survived. Also, Mr. Pak testified that Reverend Moon would always try to give extra food to the other prisoners. Sometimes his mother would come. The prison was not very far away from Reverend Moon's home, and his mother would travel a long journey by herself, trying to bring clothing or bringing food to him that she had somehow gathered together, this poor woman. And she would come and she would cry to see her son so miserable. And she would give the food to him, hoping that he could somehow survive. But Reverend Moon would actually invite the other prisoners over, and he would give these things away to the others, right in front of her. She would often be heartbroken, but she could understand his love for the others. There's one story that Mr. Pak tells us about some of the rice powder that Reverend Moon received, and he would always share his food. And so one of the prisoners one night stole food from Reverend Moon. And the other prisoners who were hoping to get some of that food, they tried to track down the thief, and they brought him. And they said, "You should punish him. He stole food from you." And Reverend Moon, they all hoped that he would punish him. Reverend Moon said, "You must have been very hungry to steal food from me. Let me give you one good meal before you die." And so he gave all the rest of the rice powder to this man. The other prisoners were very angry because they wanted that rice. But it gives you some example of his heart, how much he'd really tried to live for others. And during this time, somehow he was able to survive for 2 years and 8 months. Now what happened to liberate the prisoners was the American forces and the start of the Korean War. When the Americans came in this landing in Incheon led by MacArthur, then during that time they began bombing all around the prison. And it was under those circumstances that eventually he was released. As the bombing started, this gives you some idea of the prison. As the bombing started, the prison began killing all the prisoners. And it was the very day that Reverend Moon was to be killed. That was the day the bombs fell in such a way that all the guards left, and eventually he was released. At this point, all the refugees began pouring down from the north. People were desperate to try to escape the Chinese troops that were coming. It was a very terrible war, the Korean War, because there was almost no place for people to escape. People were being killed everywhere they went. In the countryside, the war was going on, the bombs were falling, the soldiers were there, and there were hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians killed, even as they were trying to escape from the north to the south. Well, under these circumstances, this miserable circumstance, where the people were so cold and there was no food, and anybody with any sense of survival was trying desperately to go from the north to the south to freedom, Reverend Moon thought about his followers in Pyongyang. And under these circumstances, he was probably the only person that went up north. He went on a 10-day journey to Pyongyang to find his followers. At that point, he found two. There was one young boy was about 18 years old. And then another man was Mr. Pak, who had been released earlier and had gone home and now had a broken leg. The Reverend Moon insisted on bringing these two with him down to the south, this boy and this man with a broken leg. It was very difficult to do. He had to carry, most of the time they put this man, Mr. Pak with a broken leg, on a bicycle, and they had to try to make their way on mountain paths. Well, eventually there was one attempt where Reverend Moon heard about a boat that was going to be leaving from an island and take them down to Seoul to safety. And so he actually picks up Mr. Pak on his back, and they walk through freezing cold water. The tide would rise very quickly. They had to move very fast. And they made their way to the island in the middle of the night. We have this photograph of Reverend Moon doing this, because on the island, the military forces took the boat and would not allow them to get in. But one of the UN photographers took this picture. And years later, we found this photograph of Reverend Moon with Mr. Pak on his back. And he carried him all the way back, 2 miles in the water, in the slippery water, back and through a much longer route. Mr. Pak said later on that he insisted to Reverend Moon, please, leave me here to die, because I'm going to destroy you. You can't carry me. Leave me here to die. And he said that Reverend Moon only told him, never say this. How can I take responsibility for all mankind unless I can save you? So the whole time then they insisted on bringing him south. The route that he tried to take, was to get safety here through a boat passage, but it didn't work. So eventually they had to make their way through a very long route down to Seoul and so on. They went to Seoul, but it was still too dangerous, and eventually they had to walk and take various means all the way down to Busan. It's in Busan then that our movement began. So they made their way eventually there. Mr. Pak was brought home, and now it was just Reverend Moon and this boy, Wonpo Kim. And many of the things I'm telling you are based upon what this Wonpo Kim told us from his own experience. It was in Busan. The city was completely filled with refugees. It was filled with people desperately trying to survive. There was no place to live. We know at first that the Reverend Moon and Wonpo Kim, the boy, found a home with his old roommate, Mr. Aum, who was an architect. But eventually, Reverend Moon and the boy, they create this little hut made of cardboard and so on, and mud. This was the first unification center. They couldn't even stand up inside. And it was here, in this circumstance, that they prayed, and he talked about this vision of somehow bringing an ideal world. An ideal world. His country was completely destroyed. They were poor, miserable, and hungry. There was nowhere to live, and yet he talked about this. He always had hope. And gradually, he began preaching and teaching, and one by one, people found him. Interesting thing is that during this time, by the way, this is Wonpo Kim, the boy. That was his first follower in the South. Eventually, these women came from the north who had also survived, and they found him, and they began the beginning here. But what they did was, in order to survive economically, they started something that was eventually to become a pattern. Wonpo Kim found a way to paint pictures of some of the American soldiers, and then he would paint pictures and he would sell them back to the soldiers. And so Reverend Moon and he began doing this, and this became a pattern that the early followers would find little something to sell, and they would save a little bit of money, and then they would invest it in the movement. And this is eventually how it expanded. So more and more people began to find him under these miserable circumstances. Eventually his following became bigger and bigger. There's one woman, Mrs. Kong, she was a member of another church, and she found him, and she was very ambitious, and she brought the movement to another city. Also, we have this man. He was Mr. Yu. He's a medical student. He was a doctor. And he became the first teacher of the principal besides Reverend Moon. He would always teach. And eventually, also, there was another man, Johann Lee. He was a pastor of a church. So gradually, Reverend Moon attracted, in these miserable circumstances, some prominent people. And they expanded and become bigger and bigger and bigger. It's because of his example and his faith. He was very inspiring to be with. So people gathered around him. Eventually, one of the relatives of Mr. Yu eventually started our movement in the university. But the movement spread more and more and bigger this time. And gradually it spread to different cities, and Korea itself was beginning to revive itself. Finally, when there was a big enough foundation, in 1954, our movement officially began. It's called the Holy Spirit Association for the Unification of World Christianity. This is the actual official beginning of our movement, registered with the government, 1954, in Seoul, Korea. It was a very small sign on a very tiny little building, but what an amazing purpose. And so people would walk by and laugh. How could this little place unify all of Christianity? But many times, in fact, they said this sign, people would rip off the sign, people would throw things on the sign, and they had to put the sign back up over and over again. They were constantly being ridiculed and persecuted because of this sign. And this was one of the first training places where they would teach the principle. It was a Buddhist, an old Buddhist building, Japanese building, Changparang. We still have this today. This is where Reverend Moon would come and preach and pour out his heart and teach the people, and he would speak for hours at a time. His method of teaching was very passionate. He would speak for hours and hours and hours about God's heart and about the meaning of life, about true love. And people would just be magnetized to him. Wonpil Kim would tell us stories about how people would have spiritual experiences and be drawn to the church, to the center, and they would listen to Reverend Moon speak and be so inspired. Some people would have their body healed by eating food at the building. Oh, and they just were magnetized by this man's power and vision. And more people were attracted, and the movement got larger. Eventually, what happened was that one of the music teachers at a very important university in Seoul became part of our movement. This was a very important women's college, and the women were all daughters of important people. Now remember, Korea is a very tiny place. Right? It's very tiny. It's about the size of California in America. It's very small. So everyone knows about everyone else's business. Everyone knows what's going on. And so in this university, these daughters of very important people, politicians and rich men and so on, they gradually came over to hear Reverend Moon speak. And they were really inspired by what he was talking about, an ideal world, about true love. They really loved it. And more of these young girls would come over to the center to listen. Now, one problem was that in Korea at that time, it was not legal to stay, to be in the streets after a certain hour of night. So in other words, you couldn't walk home if you stayed too late somewhere. And many times they would stay in the church center, the Unification Center, very late at night, listening to him speak, very inspired, and then they could not go home because they couldn't walk on the street. It was too late. So you can imagine what might happen. Eventually, some of the parents of these girls became concerned. The boyfriends became concerned. And they began wondering, what are these young people doing? What are these girls doing? And so more and more people were attracted to the center and listened to him speak. And more there began to be fear and suspicion. And began to be rumors about some sort of immoral sexual activity. That maybe these girls are in love with him. And so the university began to investigate. And they sent professors, like some of the people back there, professors to Reverend Moon's teaching to listen to what he was talking about. And the problem was that these teachers would come to hear him speak, and then they would join the movement. This is not what the university had planned. In fact, the head of the religion department was sent to try to destroy this little movement and bring the girls back. And she also joined. So at this point, the president of the university got very angry and very afraid, and she began spreading all kinds of lies about Reverend Moon, and lies about sexual immorality, about brainwashing, right, about brainwashing. How else could they explain why these young students were so excited about the principle? They couldn't understand. And the media, the newspapers, loved this kind of story. So they began printing many stories, printing on the front page about this sex church and about Reverend Moon and all of these things. Well, eventually what happened was the government investigated further. They put him in jail immediately. They put Reverend Moon in jail. This was in 1955. And then they began to investigate him. And they found he had done nothing wrong, nothing. But by this time, they had to find some excuse, so they tried to get him on some small charge of avoiding the draft. He was proven to be innocent of that too, and eventually, 5 months later, he was released. But nobody heard about his release. Maybe you have the same experience as we have in America. It's fun for the newspapers to print about accusations, but they're not very interested in printing about someone being innocent. Are you familiar with this technique, this situation? And all you have to do is accuse somebody, right? And make sure those accusations are put in the newspaper. Everyone assumes that he is guilty, and then that's it. That's the end. It doesn't matter whether he did it or not. So unfortunately, when Reverend Moon got out of prison, he discovered that all throughout Korea, people thought of him as a very evil man. And our movement began to get a lot of persecution. The members would be beaten. They would not be allowed to have any place to live. People would accuse them, and it became very difficult to continue. But Reverend Moon said that somehow, if they just had faith, God would work. And even though it was a very, very difficult time, many lies were spread. Gradually, still more and more people became attracted to the movement. And by the end of the 1950s, Reverend Moon had a very large following. More and more people came. And again, he demonstrated this principle of indemnity, that if you are really good and faithful and you do your best, eventually good will come. So the movement became bigger and bigger. Also at this time, they began to get some economic foundation. For instance, in the beginning, they would do things like collect scrap metal, like junk, you know, metal junk. And then they would sell it. But eventually, this foundation allowed them to build a factory. And this is where Tongil, the factory that you heard about, the machine factory, this is how Tongil was eventually begun. So they started getting a little bit bigger financial base, as well as more people. And on this foundation then, Reverend Moon eventually sent missionaries to other parts of the world. In 1959, then members went to Japan and to the United States and began the unification movement there. Also at this point, there were about 700 unification centers all throughout Korea. So it was becoming bigger and bigger. It's a really huge foundation developed. We have boats and all kinds of things as the movement becomes more and more prominent in Korea. Eventually, because of the stable foundation he had, and because of the support he had, then Reverend Moon felt that this was time that he could now marry. And so then he marries, in 1960, then Sum Young Moon and Hak Shahan are married. Very simple ceremony. At this point, then he begins his family life. That year, in 1960, they have their first child. This is the first daughter, Ye Jin, her name is. And This the first son, Hyojin. Hyojin is now in his late 20s, and it was 28, 27, and he is the head of CARP in the world, but also he's a great rock musician. He looks very different than this picture. But he's a good rock musician. I hope you have a chance to hear him play. He's very good. And here's his first son, and eventually many more children are born. And you wouldn't believe how many children they have. Do you know how many children that Reverend and Mrs. Moon have? Yeah, they have 13. So when we talk about having a good family, he's not kidding. Definitely interested in family life. 13 children. And of course, the importance of the family was always something that he emphasized. I know that you find them very interesting, but please continue when you're quiet. So the family became something very important, and as the principal teaches, and so Reverend Moon sought to make his family an example to others. Eventually, also in 1971, now Reverend Moon himself begins to work on a worldwide level. It's in 1971 that he first comes to the United States, and he begins a very ambitious campaign here. He came to America because he knew that America was the most influential country, the one that was really necessary to be part of the plan of world peace. And he knows that America was losing its traditional values, its morality, that the Christian basis in America was very poor, and America was becoming more and more selfish. So he said, I come to America because I have to bring America back to God. Now, it was very difficult to come here because he could not speak English. He knew nothing about America. But he was determined to stay here until he could help bring this country to a higher level. So beginning in 1971, he initiates a very ambitious plan of meeting many, many important people in America and speaking to the American public. So he begins, this is called the Day of Hope Tour, in which he speaks, this is in New York. He speaks with many leaders and introduces them to his thinking about the building of an ideal world. And it's a very successful tour. Eventually, he goes speaking all around many cities in America. It was called Christianity in Crisis, the new hope through a new expression of truth, and the second coming of the Messiah. He would speak very passionately in our country. I had the privilege of being part of this at that time, so I remember all of this myself. I was there. And he went around many, many cities, and he was very well received. Tens of thousands of people came to hear him speak. Do you recognize this place in New York? It was in Wall Street. This is the George Washington statue, remember, on Wall Street? And so we had many rallies all around America. This was in Wall Street. Again, the One World Crusade, one nation under God, one world under God. And gradually got more and more people to come and listen to his message. He met with many important people in America, former presidents and senators. President Nixon, also he met with him. And during this time, then our movement expands greatly, and many, many thousands come and join in our movement here. At the same time, also, there's more and more fear and concern. But also, we get bigger and bigger tours, and we find this was a gathering of 40,000 people in Madison Square Garden in New York. Do you remember where Madison Square Garden is? Right, it was right next to the hotel. Remember that huge round place? A really huge meeting place. It only holds 25,000 people, but 40,000 people came to hear him speak in 1974. So there's a lot of people outside on the sidewalk. I remember I brought my parents there to hear Reverend Moon speak, and it was very difficult for me even to get in. I had to go through some fire door. I sort of snuck in to get in to hear him. So many people came to hear him speak, and eventually, on this foundation, Reverend Moon began to go back to his own country and began a public speaking tour. And because of his popularity in America, he could go back to Korea, and he began his first public speech, the World Rally for Korean Freedom. And here he began speaking about the unification of Korea and the unification of the world. It's a huge gathering of people came for the first time. This was actually 1.2 million people. 1.2 million people came to hear him speak. According to one book of records, this is the largest gathering of human beings in recent times, in one place, on this island, to hear him speak. So he really became a very prominent person for the first time in Korea. Also on this foundation, we began sending members to other parts of the world, and to 120 countries, our movement began to spread. And he would send Americans, Japanese, and Germans together to go to these countries because they were from 3 enemy countries. And he figured if they could make unity, then that would be a basis for those countries also to make unity. So again, our campaigns in America continue, and Reverend Moon begins even more ambitious projects. He speaks in Yankee Stadium. It's a great baseball arena in New York. This time 60,000 people come to hear him speak. And again, this is in 1976. This is the birthday of America. And he finally begins even one more project. He's going to go to Washington, D.C. and speak to all the American people there. So we begin, again, this crusade to prepare for this tour. And finally, in Washington Monument, you'll be seeing this tomorrow, the Washington Monument. In the Washington Monument, he gave his final message to the American people of hope, of unity, and of returning to God. 300,000 people gathered here. Americans came to hear him speak. It was the largest religious rally ever in history of America in Washington, and it was a remarkable expression of support from the American people. From this point, all this time that I'm speaking about, Reverend Moon was right here in America the whole time, spending his time with us in a very personal way. So we saw him all the time. He would come and speak to us for hours. He would show us how things are done. He would live with us. He would sleep in the same places that we slept. He would eat where we ate. Many times we had famous McDonald's parties. And Reverend Moon would always eat in McDonald's with us, right with us, showing us the example of a true leader. But he was so, his way of speaking, his manner, attracted many thousands of American young people at a very unusual time. In 1975, 76, 77, as you know, there was a hippie movement in America, right? In the 60s and 70s, the hippies, you know, with the... I also was part of that. And everyone had very long hair and was involved with drugs and all of this. And many people were looking for new truth and love and all of this. And many young people joined with our movement at that time. But instead of having the drugs and the long hair and so on, they adopted a very different way of life. No drugs, they cut their hair, and we tried to live a responsible life. And though this should have been something that would have inspired American people, many parents and religious leaders began to get concerned. Many religious leaders became jealous. How come Reverend Moon is able to attract young Americans? And they began accusing him. And based upon the accusations in Korea, the same things come back over here. The same accusations. Maybe some sort of immoral activity, brainwashing, all of this. The same things begin now in America. And the newspapers loved it. The newspapers love it. On the front page of the New York Times, in Time Magazine, Newsweek, big articles about accusations and rumors about Reverend Moon and our movement. And it's because of those articles, which were based originally on things from Korea, then because they were in American newspapers, these were spread to all over the world. That's why you go to any country in the world and you look in their libraries, you'll find most of the information about Reverend Moon is based on these newspaper articles from the 1970s in America, in which they published all of these stories, accusations, and rumors. More and more people began to accuse the movement, accuse Reverend Moon, and more persecution began coming against us. Now, unfortunately, I don't know how much you know about American history, but Americans are very proud of our tradition of religious freedom. But at the same time, even though we do have freedom here, we also have a history of persecution of religions, of new religions. This is one story of the leader of the Mormon church. It's an American church, and he was killed by a mob. And almost every religion, when it begins in America, is persecuted. Also, we have a tradition of racial bigotry, as you know. So this is a big problem in America, religious and racial prejudice and hatred. And so Reverend Moon had two things against him. He was the wrong race, and he had the wrong religion. And so because of bigotry, many people began accusing him. How can some Oriental man come to our country and show us how to live? So they accused him. A lot of it was just plain racism. And eventually the government was pushed to investigate our movement, and many senators and politicians used this as an opportunity to advance their career. Now again, I imagine you're familiar with this technique, that you accuse somebody that is unpopular, you make a big thing out of it, a big issue out of it, and eventually it makes you look very good. So then many senators did this. This is one senator that began investigating our movement. Lots and lots of money was involved in investigating our movement and trying to accuse us in the newspapers, hoping it would get him reelected. It didn't work, but he put lots of publicity about our movement. But more and more as they looked, they could find nothing wrong that we were doing. There was no crime that Reverend Moon had committed. This was very disappointing to them. Well, if Reverend Moon has committed no crime, and believe me, they investigated us thoroughly. In fact, recently a book was written called Inquisition by a reporter who is not a member of our movement. It's a big fat book, this big. And it's all about the government's efforts to destroy Reverend Moon. And in the beginning of the book, this man, Sherwood, says that the unification movement is probably the most investigated movement in the history of America. And yet, they still could find no crime that we were committing. So because they couldn't find any crime, they had to make one up. They had to create one. So then they accused Reverend Moon of tax evasion, of not paying his taxes. Now in America, church leaders do not pay taxes. But still, they've tried to find some small rule that he broke and to accuse him and put him in jail. Also, people are not put in jail for not paying taxes. But this did not stop the government. And so at tremendous expense, over a period of months and months, Reverend Moon was brought to trial. Legal authorities knew, they accused the government that this was a false trial, but it didn't stop them. Eventually, religious leaders began realizing that what they were doing to Reverend Moon would be done against them. And so many religious leaders, for the first time, began to rise to give some attention to Reverend Moon and tried to defend him. Many churches came to our defense. There are all kinds of religious freedom rallies in support of Reverend Moon and his rights. And eventually, even some senators began to investigate what the government was doing. And so we have all kinds of people came to his defense. We have liberals and conservatives alike rising up, calling for some protection of Reverend Moon. This is one man, a very famous religious leader in America, said the Moon case is particularly frightening. Not only is the issue of religious liberty involved, but also racial discrimination. And he called upon President Reagan at that time to investigate this situation. We also have other senators who came to support Reverend Moon and to accuse the government that this was a false trial. But still, it didn't work. And eventually, Reverend Moon was sentenced to jail. Now, a very interesting thing is that Reverend Moon did not have to go to prison. He could easily have gone back to Korea, and this is what the government was really hoping for. But Reverend Moon said, I will not escape. I will go to jail for the sake of religious freedom and for the sake of my work in America. And so on this foundation then, he says goodbye to the ministers, and Reverend Moon does go into jail. This was a prison in Connecticut. Later on he said, you know, this jail is like a country club compared to my experience in jails before. But he stayed there for over a year. And interestingly enough, we have testimonies about Reverend Moon's life in prison in America from people, other prisoners who wrote letters to magazines. And many of the prisoners testified that Reverend Moon just acted like everyone else. He cleaned the toilets, he worked in the kitchen, he did the very simple work, all the time never complaining and setting a good example. Also, Reverend Moon would set a very unusual schedule, and he would pray late at night. He was the only one doing it in the whole prison. But we have all kinds of interesting stories about Reverend Moon's behavior in prison in America from other witnesses. Well, during this time, Reverend Moon began many projects even while he was in prison. He began the Washington Times newspaper while he was in prison. Even while the American government was persecuting him, still he did things to serve America, because he always wanted to live the example of loving your enemy. So eventually when Reverend Moon was released, he was released to a crowd of admirers and ministers and other leaders who now recognized that this was a man of God who had been unjustly accused. And so eventually more and more people, through this trial, the government hoped to destroy our movement, but actually it made the movement much stronger, because that's how many leaders became involved with our movement. Eventually we have all kinds of press conferences and people get up in newspapers testifying to how Reverend Moon was falsely accused. Again, we have liberals and conservatives together testifying, and eventually Reverend Moon is welcomed at a great banquet in his honor. This was a God and Freedom banquet welcoming Reverend Moon out of prison. And there were thousands of leaders around America came to welcome him. This was very different from what it was like years ago. So then, since that time, then Reverend Moon had a chance now to educate more Christian ministers in America about our movement. He invited many of them to come on a tour of Korea and Japan and teach them the principle, very much the way that you had this conference here. 7,000 ministers came from America learning about our movement directly. So again, one of the problems we find is that though Reverend Moon's becoming more and more understood and appreciated here in America and around the world, we still find that many of the old lies and accusations of the past often are the only sources of information that people have. So many times when people love someone, people have loved and admired Reverend Moon, they often don't write those things down. But it's the people who have false ideas who often get the most publicity. So this is how you can understand sometimes how people misunderstand him and why people have a bad opinion of him through lies and rumors left over from 15 years ago. Eventually, the ministers learned directly about the value of our movement and our church, and many more churches now are working with us in America and throughout the world. He initiated many projects, the Assembly of World Religions, all the things that you saw in Brian's lecture. These things are all coming from his heart of love and desire to help the world. So even out of prison, he had no resentment against America, but he continues to work here as best he can. And his desire always was that he could work also in the Soviet Union. Years ago in 1976, Reverend Moon told us that he wanted to have a rally in Moscow. And it was very hard for me to believe. It was impossible. I never could have imagined in a million years that the Soviet Union would open up and that someday we would actually meet each other and that our movement would somehow come into your country. It was almost impossible for me to believe. But eventually, as we can see, time has passed and the World Media Conference was held in your country, and many other projects have now started in your country, including this one. Reverend Moon now is being appreciated and understood. Here's the Metropolitan Philaret. Also in the Muslim, the Grand Mufti of Syria. Many of these people now come to him for advice and revere and respect him. And of course, also, you know, he met with your president as a symbol of your country, meeting with your president representing meeting all of you. He came to the Soviet Union with a desire to serve your country. He often said, years ago, he said that the Russian people and the Soviet people are very special because they are a bridge between East and West, and they have some special destiny in the work of God. That's why he wanted to come to your country to offer you a chance to hear the principle and receive whatever help he could give. And so now he continues the same work he's always been doing, the desire for world peace. This is his summit conference for world peace, bringing world leaders together to discuss how to practically bring about an end to war. He never has stopped and changed. From the time he was 16 years old, Reverend Moon has never changed his purpose and his message. I know many of you have a hard time imagining, why does someone like me and the other Americans, why do we believe in this? I mean, realistically, how can we believe in all of this idea of an ideal world and true love and all of this? Are we crazy? You know, either we're crazy or very stupid, one or the other. How can we really believe in this? Well, you know, the reason why I believe in this, and I think if you ask the other members, the reason why we believe in this is not just because we feel the principle seems true, but many of us believe that the principle is true and that these ideals can come true because I saw it in Reverend Moon. I saw the example in him. Because he is such a consistent example of true love, because I saw him do it, this is why I believe it's possible. Otherwise, I wouldn't believe it. It's because I actually saw it with my own eyes. So I really hope that you have a chance to know him in some way, and then you maybe also can believe that people can be good, that we really can change the world. I believe this because of what he has done in his own life. I saw it with my own eyes. If you want to understand something about Reverend Moon, I hope that you can get more involved with our movement and also study the principle more deeply. But I hope that if there's anything good that you see in us and the staff, if there's anything good that you recognize in our leaders here, I hope that you can see that somehow through us, you can experience something about this man and what he's like. And I hope that as he wants to meet you directly, as he would like to be here right now, I hope that you can actually meet him yourself and see for yourself. He's a good man, a man of God, and someone that can show us a way to actually bring about an ideal world of peace. Thank you very much.
Do you see any considerable reasons which could damage the plan of attaining the world peace until the year 2000?
Do I see any barrier or some obstacle, is that the idea?
Yeah.
To accomplishing the task of world peace by the year 2000? Definitely. Yes. In other words, honestly, when I look with my own eyes, it's very difficult for me to imagine how world peace could ever come by the year 2000. However, because of Reverend Moon's own example and what he has said, Reverend Moon, years ago, Reverend Moon said certain things would happen. And every one of these things always came true. He said that he would come to America someday. And his people were starving, he was hungry, and he said, someday I'll come to America, and he was right. He said, someday I'll have a big rally in Washington, D.C. It was impossible, but it happened. He said, someday we will go to the Soviet Union. And it seemed impossible, but it happened. And he predicted, for instance, when the Soviet Union would go through a big change. He predicted when this would happen, and it happened. So honestly speaking, I don't know how we can attain world peace practically by the year 2000, but Reverend Moon does. And basically, he hasn't failed yet in predicting what happens, so I'm guessing that probably somehow it will happen. I can only know that by following the principles, somehow this will come true. I'm sorry I can't take any more questions, but you're welcome to ask me or anyone else about Reverend Moon yourself during the rest of this conference. Thank you.
Please let's give John Williams one round of applause. So just a few small announcements. So the registration forms for the summer advanced workshops, we need to